4 days after the Twin Towers fell, 8 people drove off the edge of a bridge in the dark and dropped 85 feet into the water. The Queen Isabella Causeway was the only road connecting South Padre Island to mainland Texas. A barge struck its support columns at 2 in the morning, and 2 spans simply vanished. A gap with no warning lights, no barriers, nothing. 11 vehicles went straight over the edge. 3 survivors were pulled from the water by fishermen who happened to be underneath. Because the country was reeling from September 11th, almost nobody heard about it. That bridge was the lifeline. It carried every tourist, every grocery delivery, every ambulance, every dollar that kept the island alive. And when it fell, South Padre Island became what it had been for most of human history, a strip of sand cut off from everything, unreachable, alone. The strange part is that the island's entire modern existence depended on a version of that bridge being built in the first place. Before 1954, there was almost nothing there. The island itself is ancient, a barrier island, narrow as a ribbon, running along the southernmost tip of the Texas Gulf Coast. For centuries, the only permanent residents were Karankawa Indians, sea turtles, and migratory birds. The Spanish called it Isla Blanca, the White Island, and mostly left it alone. It had no fresh water, no harbor worth using, no timber, no mineral wealth anyone could reach. It was sand and wind and waves, and for a long time, nobody wanted any of it. Ships wrecked on its shores with grim regularity. The Spanish called it dangerous, a place of hostile Indians and enemy intrigue. During the Civil War, the island was quarantined entirely, special patrols walking its beaches to prevent Confederate saboteurs and spies from landing on the deserted sand. From the ocean, flotsam and dead bodies sometimes washed ashore, and the citizens of Port Isabel on the mainland reported hearing explosions out in the Gulf at night, seeing bright flashes on the horizon. For most of its recorded history, Padre Island was a place things happened to, never a place anyone chose. Then, in 1759, King Carlos III of Spain granted the island to a man named Nicolas Ballí, patriarch of one of the most powerful landowning families in the lower Rio Grande Valley. The Ballís had arrived from Spain by way of Mexico City in 1569, and over 2 centuries accumulated more than 1 million acres across South Texas and northern Mexico. They were landed aristocracy in a borderland that had very little aristocracy of any kind. But it was Nicolas's grandson who would give the island its name. Padre José Nicolás Ballí was born around 1770 in Reynosa, Mexico. He studied at the seminary in Monterrey, was ordained a Catholic priest, and came home to manage an enormous portfolio of land grants while simultaneously conducting more than 500 baptisms, marriages, and funerals across the Rio Grande Valley. Around 1800, he applied to King Charles IV for formal title to the island, 11.5 leagues of sand and salt grass. And by 1804, he had established the first permanent settlement, Rancho Santa Cruz de Buena Vista, a cattle operation about 26 miles north of the island's southern tip. He ran cattle, horses, and mules there with the help of his nephew, Juan Jose. 2 hired hands lived on the island to oversee operations. The Padre himself never lived there full time. He died in 1829, was buried near Matamoros, and the title was granted to him posthumously. The people who had known him, out of affection, simply called the island La Isla del Padre, Padre Island. Juan Jose kept the ranch going until 1844, when a storm drove him back to the mainland. After that, the island drifted into a kind of limbo, owned by the Ballí heirs in scattered parcels, used occasionally for ranching, visited by fishermen and smugglers, battered by hurricanes, but never really developed. The family held on to their titles through the Mexican Revolution, through Texas independence, through statehood, through decades of drought and poverty. They held on until a young man from New York arrived in 1938. His name was Gilbert Curlin. He was 24 years old, fresh out of Harvard Law School, and he had been sent to South Texas by his uncle, a Bronx attorney named Frederick Gilbert, who had a hunch there might be oil beneath the island's sand. Curlin's assignment was simple: find the Ball heirs and buy their titles. South Texans have a saying: if you throw a rock in the Rio Grande Valley, you're going to hit a Ballí. The family was enormous, sprawling across both sides of the border, connected by blood and by the shared memory of what they had once owned. But by 1938, that memory was about all they had left. The droughts of the 1890s had destroyed their ranching operations. The Great Depression finished the job. Many of the heirs had little formal education. Some spoke only Spanish. The land they still held title to, this long, desolate island that no one could easily reach and that seemed to produce nothing but wind and sand, felt like a burden, not an inheritance. Curlin tracked down all 27 separate titles, scattered among dozens of heirs across the valley. No one knows exactly how much he paid for each, but by all accounts, it was almost nothing. Small cash payments to people who were desperate and who had no reason to believe a barrier island with no fresh water and no road access was worth anything more. Family members later said Curlin discussed mineral rights as an afterthought. He wrote down their names and addresses and agreed to contact them if he ever discovered oil or gas. Then he left South Texas. The Balls never heard from him again. What Curlin had purchased was one of the greatest land bargains in American history. He leased the mineral rights to oil companies and collected royalties for decades. The family, meanwhile, slid deeper into poverty, watching from the mainland as the island that bore their ancestors' name generated wealth for strangers. It would take them more than 60 years to get to a courtroom. In 2000, a Brownsville jury found that Curlin had swindled the family out of $1.1 million in oil and gas royalties and awarded $3.3 million in damages. The story ran in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, papers as far away as Argentina. But in 2008, the Texas Supreme Court overturned the verdict on a technicality. The statute of limitations had expired. The family had waited too long to file. 300 Ballí descendants split nothing. By then, the island they had once owned had become something none of them could have imagined. The transformation began with concrete and steel. In February 1954, the first Queen Isabella Causeway opened, a $2.2 million two-lane swing bridge stretching 15,272 feet from downtown Port Isabel across the Laguna Madre to the southern tip of the island. On Dedication Day, July 3, 1954, thousands of vehicles lined up to pay the $1 toll and drive across. By late October, the 100,000th crossing was celebrated. For the first time in its history, the island was reachable by car. Before the bridge, South Padre had virtually nothing. A handful of fishing camps, a cluster of cottages accessible only by ferry from Port Isabel, where for $2 you could take your car across the bay on a flat-bottom boat and then navigate the sand as best you could, because paved roads on the island were almost non-existent. In the 1920s, civic leaders had tried to lure tourists by building several small seaside hotels on wooden piers extending over the Gulf. Romantic, but flimsy structures that the ocean dismantled at its leisure. After the causeway opened, everything came at once. A bathhouse with 400 lockers at Isla Blanca Park, bait stands, concession shops, and then, slowly, motels, restaurants, and the first tourist-oriented businesses. On opening day, a truck full of officials attempting to be the first to officially cross the bridge was stopped two-thirds of the way by steel barricades. The telephone system wasn't quite finished. They completed the trip in a dump truck, which a Brownsville Herald reporter described as the most comfortable dump truck anyone had ever ridden in. By August 20th, 73,462 vehicles had paid the toll. The 100,000th crossing came in late October. But growth was fragile. The causeway sat dangerously low over the water, and high tides regularly flooded the roadway with seawater and seaweed. The swing bridge opened for barge traffic through the intracoastal canal, stranding drivers in long lines. Storms turned the road into an obstacle course. Getting to the island required patience, timing, and a certain tolerance for the possibility that you might not get back. Then Beulah came. On September 20th, 1967, Hurricane Beulah made landfall near Brownsville as a Category 3 storm with winds exceeding 130 miles per hour. The storm surge reached as high as 15 to 20 feet along the coast. It carved 31 new channels through Padre Island, literally slicing the barrier island into pieces. Port Isabel, the mainland town that served as the island's gateway, was devastated. Officials estimated 80 to 90% of its homes and commercial buildings were severely damaged. South Padre Island itself was almost entirely submerged. What little had been built was flattened or washed away. But here is where the story takes a turn that would define everything that followed. The destruction cleared the slate. Where there had been a scattering of modest structures on sand dunes, there was now nothing, which meant there was an opportunity. The causeway itself was damaged but repaired, and in the years after Beulah, the island began to rebuild, this time with ambition. In 1973, the residents of South Padre Island voted to incorporate as a city. The population at the time was tiny. Estimates suggest a few hundred people. But incorporation gave them the power to zone, regulate development, and collect taxes. In 1974, a new Queen Isabella Causeway replaced the old two-lane swing bridge. This one was 4 lanes wide, 2.37 miles long, with an 80-foot clearance over the water. It cost $12 million and doubled traffic capacity overnight. The old causeway was partially demolished. Its remaining sections were converted into fishing piers. With the new bridge came the boom, and it came fast. Faster than anyone had planned for, faster than building codes or fire codes or environmental regulations could keep pace. Hotels, condominiums, and apartment complexes rose along the beachfront in a cascade that one early resident compared to watching the Florida coast 30 years earlier, except better. Developers bulldozed sand dunes, the island's natural defense against hurricanes, to make room for buildings with names like Bahia Mar, Tiki, Sunchase, and Saida Towers. A Hilton went up near the south end, a Holiday Inn. Gleaming white condominium projects climbed 5, 10, 15 stories into the salt air. A man named Bob Hanmore, standing on his 5th-floor balcony in the early 1980s, looked out over the Gulf and told a visiting reporter that the view in front of him, the unbroken ocean, was the west coast of Florida 30 years ago, except better. Behind him, to the landward side, the construction cranes swung. The population, which had been an estimated 314 people in 1978, tripled to over 1,000 by the late 1980s. By 1990, it was nearly 1,700. By 2000, almost 2,500. The businesses multiplied alongside the residents, 111 in the late 1980s, 243 by the turn of the century. Many of the condominiums and private homes were owned by foreigners, Mexican nationals, Canadian investors, anyone who recognized that beachfront property on a barrier island in the subtropics, accessible by a brand new 4-lane bridge, was a speculation worth making. Nearly all of the businesses existed to serve one thing: tourism. Some people who had been there before the boom watched it with a feeling closer to dread than excitement. A couple named Don and Edna Veach, environmentalists who published a small magazine and led beach tours, saw the dunes disappearing under bulldozer blades and understood what it meant. They tear down the dunes, and there's nothing to stop the sand when it blows off the beach, Don told a reporter. This island's being blown out of the water, and I mean that literally. He was right about the danger, but wrong about the mechanism. The daily wind was only a small part of the erosion problem. The real threat was storms, and without the dunes, the island had no buffer. But the money was flowing. This was the deal the island made, and by the time anyone thought to question it, the deal was done. South Padre had no factory, no port, no military base, no university, No industry of any kind that wasn't built on pleasure. It had beaches, sunshine, and a bridge. The entire economy rested on convincing people to cross that bridge and spend money, and for a while, it worked spectacularly. Then Texas gave the island an unexpected gift by refusing to cooperate with the federal government. Between 1983 and 1985, the state of Texas held out against raising its legal drinking age from 18 to 21. Every other state was falling in line with the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which threatened to withhold federal highway funds from holdouts. Texas resisted. For roughly a year, college students under 21 could legally drink in Texas when they couldn't drink almost anywhere else in the country outside of Louisiana. The result was predictable. Tens of thousands of students who might have gone to Fort Lauderdale or Daytona Beach discovered South Padre Island instead. The beaches were just as warm, the bars were open, and nobody was going to card you. Spring break on South Padre had existed in some form since the 1970s, but the drinking age holdout turned it into a phenomenon. By the mid-1980s, the island's population swelled by 50,000 or more every March. The money was extraordinary. Millions of dollars in hotel occupancy taxes, sales taxes, mixed beverage taxes, all concentrated into a few chaotic weeks. Promoters organized massive beach concerts. Bars competed to outdo each other. MTV showed up. The island became one of the most recognized spring break destinations in the country. The problem was that the people who lived there year-round, the ones who'd incorporated the city, who ran the restaurants and rental shops, who raised kids on the island, had to live through it. Every March, their quiet strip of sand became something unrecognizable. Police responded to hundreds of high-level offenses and misdemeanors. People died. In 2017, spring break drew roughly 137,000 visitors. 3 people died that year. 762 serious incidents were recorded, and that was considered normal. A resident named Shane Wilson headed a group called Property Owners Who Care and gathered 500 signatures on a petition to control the crowds. Spring breakers had started spilling out of the beach and tourist zones and into residential neighborhoods. Loud music at all hours, public intoxication on quiet streets. Wilson and his wife eventually gave up and left the island every March, donating their home as temporary housing for the expanded spring break police force. Clayton Brashear, who owned Clayton's Beach Bar and Grill, billed as the largest beach bar in Texas, fired back with his own petition, arguing that existing laws just needed better enforcement. His petition drew 1,500 signatures. The city eventually passed a large event ordinance in July 2017, requiring promoters to pay more for security. It was a compromise nobody loved. Meanwhile, the island kept building, and one project in particular captured the essential recklessness of the boom. In 2006, a developer called Ocean Tower LP, led by a man named Antoon Domet, broke ground on what was supposed to be the tallest structure in the Rio Grande Valley, a 31-story luxury condominium tower on the beachfront, designed by Walker and Perez Architects, built by coastal constructors Southwest Ventures, a subsidiary of the massive Zachary Construction Corporation. 151 units, Italian marble floors, granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, custom cabinets, oversized jacuzzi tubs, stand-up showers, a spa, a gym, swimming pools, a media room. The parking garage alone was 4 stories tall, built with post-tensioned concrete. The promotional materials promised unprecedented views over the ocean. The units were priced accordingly. This was not spring break housing, but a statement that South Padre Island had arrived as a luxury destination. The building rose on a narrow strip of sand just miles from the Mexican border, in soil characterized by a high water table and sandy, unstable ground. The geotechnical consultant was a San Antonio firm. The engineering was supposed to account for the conditions. By May 2008, the tower had been topped out. 31 stories of reinforced concrete, half-clad in glass, some of the lower floors already fitted with fixtures. Then the cracks appeared. The columns supporting the parking garage began to fracture. Engineers discovered that the core of the skyscraper had sunk more than 14 inches into its foundation. The tower and the garage had been built connected, but they were settling at different rates, the massive weight of the tower pressing down into the soft ground, while the lighter garage stayed relatively stable. The differential was tearing the structure apart. Beams cracked, pile caps fractured. The building began to lean. They called it the Leaning Tower of South Padre Island, also faulty towers. Construction stopped immediately. The general contractor, a subsidiary of Zachary Construction, left the site by November 2008. The developer initially vowed to fix it, but forensic investigations revealed the repairs would cost more than the building was worth. In September 2009, they announced it would be demolished. On December 13, 2009, at least 1,500 spectators gathered on shore and on dozens of boats in the Laguna Madre to watch. Controlled Demolition, Inc. of Baltimore, the same company that had imploded structures all over the world, spent 6 months preparing the job. Mark Lazo, the company's president, later said it was the most complicated implosion he'd ever attempted. The building was distressed, unstable, a hybrid of post-tensioned concrete and reinforced concrete that was already failing. It weighed 55,000 tons. At the time, it was the tallest reinforced concrete structure ever demolished by implosion. It took 12 seconds to fall. The rubble was cleared by March 2010. The site was restored to a flat, empty lot. A 31-story monument to ambition and bad engineering, reduced to nothing in the time it takes to draw a breath. The island's skyline had a gap where a tower should have been, and the gap told a story the promotional brochures never mentioned, that the ground beneath South Padre Island does not always cooperate with the things people try to build on it. But the island's most haunting story had already happened years earlier, on a night when the country was looking elsewhere. September 15, 2001, 2 in the morning. 4 days after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, every American was on edge. Ports of entry along the Mexican border were closed. The nation felt fragile in a way it hadn't in decades. On the Laguna Madre, beneath the Queen Isabella Causeway, Roberto Espericueta and his cousins were night fishing. It was the kind of thing people did in South Texas on warm September nights. Anchored under the bridge, lines in the water, the hum of traffic overhead fading to almost nothing at that hour. The bridge rose 80 feet above them, its lights tracing a pale line across the dark water toward the island. Then a towing vessel pushing 4 barges, whether through mechanical failure, navigational error, or the strong currents of the Laguna Madre, the exact cause would be debated for years, slammed into 2 of the bridge's 80-foot support columns. 2 spans collapsed instantly. A third gave way moments later. A 240-foot section of the bridge simply ceased to exist. Concrete and steel rained into the water around Espericueta's boat. Where there had been a road, there was now a gap. Nothing below it but darkness and 70 feet of air, and then the bay. 11 vehicles drove into the gap. The drivers couldn't see the missing road. There were no warning lights, no barriers, no flares, no time. At highway speed, by the time headlights revealed nothing ahead but empty space, it was far too late. They went over the edge and fell 85 feet into the Laguna Madre. Some of the cars were carrying couples. Barry and Chelsea Welch were married, both from Port Isabel. They went into the water together. Espericueta and his cousins were directly below. For the first 30 minutes, they were convinced they were under attack, that Al-Qaeda had bombed the bridge. The whole country was on high alert, and now concrete was raining into the water around them. But they didn't run. They pulled 3 people from the water alive. 8 others did not survive. Their names: Bob Harris, Hector Martinez Jr., Barry and Chelsea Welch of Port Isabel, Julio Mireles, Robin Lavelle, Sitvan Francisco Rivas, Gaspar Hinojosa, were read at memorials that most of America never saw. Had September 11th not happened 4 days earlier, the collapse would have been national front-page news. Instead, it disappeared into the shadow of a larger catastrophe. The bridge was repaired and reopened in a record 2 months by November 21st, 2001, a month ahead of schedule. The $4.3 million emergency repair was a feat of engineering urgency driven by economic desperation. Emergency barriers were installed that could block the lanes in minutes if anything went wrong again. The bridge was renamed the Queen Isabella Memorial Causeway. An octagonal memorial honoring the victims was unveiled in October 2002. But the fundamental problem remained, as obvious as the gap in the bridge had been. There was still only one road. 2,000 tourists had been stranded on the island when the bridge fell. The Texas Department of Transportation scrambled to send a ferry from Port Aransas, more than 100 miles up the coast, to shuttle cars off the island. Electrical and phone lines, which ran along the causeway superstructure, went out sporadically during repairs, leaving parts of the island without power or communications. Grocery stores couldn't restock. Restaurants couldn't open. Workers who lived on the mainland couldn't get to their jobs. For a community that depended entirely on visitors being able to drive in and spend money, the collapse wasn't just a tragedy. It was a preview of what could happen again, at any time, if a barge drifted off course, if a hurricane weakened the pilings, if the concrete that held everything together simply gave way. Ed Siganevich, who was mayor at the time, later said there was not a day he drove over the causeway without thinking about it. The music playing in the car, a conversation with a passenger, it didn't matter. At a certain point on the bridge, the memory always came back. And the talk of building a second bridge, a second way on and off the island, had been going on even before the collapse. 2 decades later, it still hadn't been built. The traffic kept growing. The population kept rising. Hurricane evacuation plans still depended on funneling every car, truck, and bus across a single 2.37-mile span. A second access project was studied, debated, and delayed again and again. While the island waited for a second bridge, the forces working against it kept multiplying. Beach erosion was eating the shoreline at rates that alarmed even the engineers. An estimated 64% of the Texas coast was eroding at an average of 6 feet per year, and South Padre was no exception. Storms accelerated the damage. Hurricane Hannah in 2020, Tropical Storm Beta the same year, Tropical Storm Alberto in 2024, each one pulling sand off the beach and into the Gulf. The city signed agreements with the Texas General Land Office for beach renourishment, spending millions to pump sand back onto shores the ocean was steadily reclaiming. But renourishment is not a solution. It is an ongoing expense, a subscription fee for keeping the beach in roughly the same place it was last year. Then came the seaweed. Sargassum, a brown, berry-studded floating algae that has always existed in the Atlantic, began washing ashore in quantities that no one had seen before. Starting around 2011, massive blooms drifted across the ocean from West Africa to the Gulf of Mexico in what researchers at the University of South Florida called the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, a formation that in some years stretched 5,000 miles across the open ocean. The causes were not fully understood. Theories pointed to changing ocean temperatures, nutrient runoff from rivers like the Amazon, Saharan dust carried by wind into the South Atlantic, and possibly even the after effects of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. What was clear was that the blooms were getting worse, arriving earlier, lasting longer, and dumping extraordinary amounts of seaweed on coastlines from Barbados to Brownsville. When it piled up on the beach, it formed thick mats that covered the sand, turned brown and rotten in the sun, attracted insects, and emitted hydrogen sulfide, the smell of rotten eggs. It smothered sea turtle nesting sites. It drove tourists away from the water line. The city tried raking the beaches mechanically, then realized that sargassum actually played a role in trapping sand and preventing erosion. Removing it made the beach look cleaner, but accelerated the very problem that threatened the island's existence. This was the paradox the island could never quite escape. The things that made it attractive, the wide beaches, the wild shoreline, the remoteness, were the same things that made it fragile. Every building put up was a bet against the next hurricane. Every dollar earned depended on sand staying in place. Every visitor crossed a bridge that had already collapsed once. Just to the south, across the Brazos-Santiago Pass, something entirely new was reshaping the landscape. In 2014, SpaceX broke ground on a launch facility at Boca Chica Beach, a stretch of wild coastline that had been, until then, one of the most remote and undeveloped beaches in Texas. Elon Musk's company chose the site for testing and launching Starship, the largest rocket ever built, designed for missions to Mars. The economic impact was significant, more than $51 million annually in salaries, hundreds of new jobs in the Brownsville area, tens of thousands of spectators who traveled to watch launches from the island's southern tip. But the launches also required road closures. State Highway 4, the only road to Boca Chica Beach, shut down regularly for testing and launch operations, cutting off access to popular fishing spots, camping areas, and the beach itself. The newly incorporated city of Starbase, formerly the unincorporated community around SpaceX's facility, voted itself into existence in 2025 with just 218 votes. Environmental regulators cited SpaceX for Clean Water Act violations and unauthorized wastewater discharges. Indigenous groups fought for access to cultural sites on the beach. And South Padre Island watched its southern neighbor transform from a quiet wilderness into the staging ground for interplanetary travel, bringing visitors and controversy in roughly equal measure. In 2026, SpaceX bought land worth at least $2.1 million on South Padre Island itself. The company's footprint was expanding, its presence on the landscape becoming impossible to separate from the island's future. And SpaceX even proposed a solution to the island's access problem, but not the one anyone expected. The Boring Company, another Musk venture, floated the idea of drilling a tunnel from the south end of South Padre Island to Boca Chica Beach. County officials were skeptical. The cost would be enormous, the scope limited, and the motivation transparently self-serving. Musk wanted easier access for SpaceX employees and spectators. The tunnel was never built. The second bridge was still being studied. Today, South Padre Island has a year-round population of roughly 2,000 people and receives millions of visitors annually. Hotel occupancy tax revenue in June 2025 was up more than 10% over the previous year. Sales tax was up. Mixed beverage tax was up. The Convention and Visitors Bureau pointed out that collections were 43% higher than pre-pandemic levels. Officials launched new marketing campaigns targeting Austin and San Antonio, chasing the transplants moving to Texas who might not know the island existed. But some business owners on the island told a different story, one that the tax receipts couldn't quite capture. Andy Hancock, who had been teaching sandcastle building lessons on the beach for 22 years, said the revenue numbers were misleading, that prices had risen with inflation, but the actual number of visitors coming through the door had thinned. A hotel room that cost $120 a night 5 years ago now cost $180, so revenue went up even if fewer people were sleeping in it. Stays were getting shorter. The mix was shifting. Vacation rental managers reported that guests from North and Central Texas, the island's traditional base, had declined. The spring breakers kept coming, and in 2024, when Miami publicly broke up with spring break in a viral social media campaign, South Padre was happy to absorb the overflow. The island's year-round population swelled by more than 50,000 every March. Residents gritted their teeth and bore it, recognizing the economic impact. But families were harder to attract. The reputation for chaos, 3 deaths during spring break in 1 year, hundreds of arrests, neighborhoods overrun, lingered long after the beach was cleaned up. The winter Texans, the retirees from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ontario, who migrated south every November, filling the condos and RV parks and mobile home communities until March, attending dances and craft shows and bird-watching excursions at the South Padre Island Birding and Nature Center, were still a crucial part of the economy, the quiet backbone that kept businesses alive during the off-season. License plates from cold weather states clustered in parking lots from Thanksgiving to Easter. But the generation that had built the winter Texan tradition was aging out, and whether younger retirees would adopt the same patterns was an open question. The original Queen Isabella Causeway, the 1954 bridge that started everything, was still partially standing in the Laguna Madre, its old pilings and decking deteriorating in the salt water. In 2025, the Texas General Land Office began demolishing what remained. The concrete and steel would be hauled 10 miles offshore and sunk to create an artificial reef, a habitat for the marine life that the island's economy also partially depended on. A $9.2 million project to turn the bones of the old bridge into something fish could live in. The Ballí family statue, a bronze likeness of Padre Jose Nicolas Ballí, still stands sentinel at the eastern foot of the causeway. He faces the island he once owned and that was taken from his descendants for almost nothing. Behind him, the bridge rises over the water, carrying the traffic that keeps the island alive. Ahead of him, the condos and hotels and souvenir shops line Padre Boulevard. Somewhere beneath the sand, there may still be oil. The family never saw a cent of it. The bridge carries about 20,000 vehicles on a busy summer day. One road on, one road off. The emergency barriers installed after the 2001 collapse can seal the lanes in minutes if something goes wrong. But the question the island has never fully answered is not whether the barriers work. It is what happens to a place that has built everything, its economy, its identity, its future, on a single narrow connection to the rest of the world. On a strip of sand, the ocean is slowly pulling away, and on the hope that people will keep choosing to come. The wind picks up off the Gulf most afternoons. It carries sand across Padre Boulevard, depositing thin ridges against the curbs, the way it has been doing since before the road existed, since before the causeway, since before Padre Ballí ran cattle on the dunes. Sometimes, if the sargassum is thick on the shore, the wind carries something else, a faint smell, sulphurous and sharp, drifting in from the rotting seaweed on the beach. The tourists wrinkle their noses. The locals don't mention it. The sand keeps moving.